Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I'm with Dr. Jared Clemons, who, um, where are you teaching now, Dr. Clemons?
Temple University in
At
Philly.
Temple. Yeah, at Temple. Um, and you are in the dreaded field of political science, but you work in what I like to call political economy to both remove the nasty stank of both economics and political science from your work. But to get into what we're doing, and we're going to turn this into the current moment a bit, but um, we were talking off air about your turn to the left, and I was telling you about my first realization that systemic racism was real. um, which in a very material sense, which was just looking at actuarial tables and watching numbers compound on people of color.
Yeah.
And then realizing that my boss was a graduate from Morehouse, and that explicit bigotry had nothing to do with it, and also implicit bias had nothing to do with it. So the two most commonly talked about frameworks in the early aughts, discussions of race, I guess there were three. There's the legal theory, which was explicit bigotry. There was the emerging power plus privilege theory, which has kind of fallen away into whatever.
I actually saw a tweet when someone using the power plus privilege thing maybe a month or two ago, and I almost threw my phone across the room because I thought it was done.
Even Abraham X. Kendi said that was dumb. So I figured that was like the nail in that coffin, but I apparently was wrong. And then I guess at the time, the other thing that was really emerging was focus on implicit bias studies, which was, I think that research is a little bit later when it really catches fire, but it was beginning in the early aughts. It's probably beginning even earlier than that, but I was aware of it and starting to see it in the early aughts.
Now we have diversity training.
Yeah. Well, I've had a kind of dual nature with this. I am obviously a melaninly challenged individual, and however, I am ethnically ambiguous, and some people actually confuse me for being mixed race. I am, but I'm not that kind of mixed race. So
Well, one of the most powerful things about race is that technically everyone should be racially or ethnically ambiguous, because that's part of the way the ideology is able to function.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things I realize as being part of the off-white hordes is that whiteness was provisional for me, like it is for like a lot of Latin people, for historically until probably about a generation and a half ago for Jews. It's not that I wasn't white, I was, but that I wasn't quite white,
right?
And rumors about like having black ancestry, being called zebra as a kid, and I grew up in a very racially diverse, well, it wasn't racially diverse, a very black and white area. It was like 50-50 suburban exurb area. So
what region of the country was this?
Central Georgia.
Macon,
Georgia.
Louisiana. So when you said that, I was automatically assumed that it had to be somewhere in the South.
Yes, it's the South thing. And in the 80s too, not the greatest time. Probably one of the, post segregation, probably one of the more bad times actually. But so I'd had these questions of race in my head. I had, like I said, I come from a very intermarried family. I have both Black and Korean cousins, and my experience of racial discourse, however, in college was radically different from the way it is today. And it was also shocking to me because, on one hand, our discussions about race became more refined and more well, I would say granular, but that's not true. But they became more refined, more clear. People dropped problematic language. I remember it being explained to me that when I said a certain word that means to cheat someone, that it was actually a racial slur of a race I didn't know, so I didn't recognize it as such. Like, so there was all this kind of latent unpacking, and yet, as I pointed out, as I became more and more liberal, except for the very, very well-educated people of color, my world became wider and wider, ironically. Like, it was just immediately clear to me that, like, well, when I was hanging out with the problematic people as a blue collar kid, there were black people everywhere. And now that I am at a state university about to head into graduate school, there aren't that many black people, and they talk like me. And that was a kind of huge realization at the same time that I'm having this realization that, oh, this structural racism stuff is very real. It's not something I'm learning from a book. I'm seeing it in the numbers and the stats, and I don't know what to do about that. So I wanted to kind of tie this into your work, because there's two things into your history a little bit. You talk a lot about the privatization of racial responsibility. And I find that framework for addressing this to be very interesting. For example, the whole, and I've kind of noticed this offhand since the end of the aughts, actually. There's this way in which we talk about checking your privilege, but we talk about systemic privileges. And I'm like, okay, but what is this reflection doing for the systemic privileges other than maybe assuaging my conscience or changing, if I accidentally use racial slurs I don't understand in my common speech? Like, what is this actually doing about the flip back over actuarial tables that I see going all the way back to redlining, when I started looking at this historically, when I'm working at an insurance company? So.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it has little to do with those things. So this might sound slightly controversial, but I think your point about, as you kind of, let's say, ascended the class ladder, you noticed that many of the Black people that you were encountering had probably similar kind of, let's say, I know we love habitus here. In some ways, it's a very similar kind of thing. Like you're embedded in similar environments. Your social science might be useful. You have a certain frame to understand certain issues that you're kind of just always enmeshed in. And one thing that I've discovered is there is a real way that certain people can materially benefit from white white sympathy or white guilt or whatever white fragility or whatever the fuck Robin DiAngelo said. And so I think part of it is like, of course, yes, most Black people in America are not going to benefit from any of the check your privilege. You need to give up some of your white whatever, are not going to benefit from that at all. But in the areas where that type of language tends to have some currency, there actually can be benefits from it. Whether that is, and working in the academy, I see it all the time. Like, especially after the George Floyd moment, now some of that money is dried up. But when there was actual real money to get in the midst of that, or let's say in the aftermath of that, a lot of the programs that I saw come out of it was definitely tapping into this. Oh, this is a white supremacist institution, and so like white people in these institutions need to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. And I remember I was given a talk once, And someone asked me why I didn't think that anything came out of the George Floyd protests. And I said, I think things did come out of the George Floyd protests if you worked at Goldman Sachs or if you worked in the academy. Outside of that, I mean, it's a fair question. I don't think that most Black people have benefited from it. But kind of as Adolf Reed has said before, Black politics is very much a class politics. And so I think part of the way you can understand it is by like actually admitting that, and then from there trying to do some of the evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I've always both loved about Adolf Reed, but not always loved about all of his supporters, because there is a certain kind of like socialist do bro, not that I think picks on to Adolf Reed correctly. Like what he's saying is correct, but their reasons for doing it is kind of an absolution for thinking about race altogether. And in some ways, I get that. Like I kind of understand it. In other ways, I think that still leaves you with a very like deracinated view of even what Adolf Reed is talking about, because he's not saying there isn't a Black politics that's viable beyond a Black class politics, but that Black class politics is all we really have. However, a broad-based class politics would be broadly copacetic to a Black politics, but since it doesn't call itself by that name, would also have the distinguished benefit of being harder to paint as something backlashable in a racial culture war.
Right.
And I remember, not to pick on Abraham X. Kendi, as we're recording this is right after his most recent debacle. But I was kind of taken at first of the new race of the new, like, let's say race first or race reductionist. I'm not sure if I would call it. I think he was race reductionist. I think he kind of moved away in the last year, but not a lot. View of thinking about race that you see in X. Kendi and D'Angelo, etc. I was surprised where they went to it, because X. Kendi's first popular book on the like development of race is actually, stamped from the beginning, is actually not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, it's not new. Like, it's a very retread, but it's a good retread.
Like, if you're a white liberal, it is probably the first time you've read some of these things, unless you were educated in racial studies. Like, yeah. But it's a decent retread. But then what I was going to bring out from X. Kendi, what I found shocking actually when he first did it, was like this argument that was made that we need to collapse all kinds of racism into one category just called racism, in which you're either for or against, and that's how and you're for or against it consequentially based on your policy habits. But also that if something is good but is not done as an anti-racist action, even if it is good for racial outcomes, it is still considered a racist position. And I was like, in what world does that make either analytical or tactical sense?
Right. I suffered through How to Be an Anti-Racist when it first came out, but I don't think he ever explicitly defines racism, or if he does, it's very circular, if I remember right. So I remember reading the book being like, well, how can you distinguish what anti-racism is if you don't like actually define racism? And that's not to say that there's an easy definition. I mean, people have been debating about what that is for a very long ass time. But to me, like, if you're going to insert yourself into that debate, it seems worthwhile to like actually define what that is. And so, yeah, even the either or fallacy aside, there was definitional problems as well with that text.
Yeah, I think he doesn't define it there. I got his definition from interviews. And even then, he doesn't actually define what racism is. He just says that he doesn't think that like talking about systemic racism, implicit bias, and bigotry separately is anything but confusing. And I'm like, but I don't think I'm like, okay, from the standpoint of convincing people racism is bad, maybe I can see that. But from the standpoint of explaining how these different sociological and complex developments actually work, I don't see that at all.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah, that were. I just. I'm also always wondering, like, what people think what the aim is. Like, what is to be gained from telling people that you are either like racist or anti-racist, and but also not defining it. But like, what is like what is that doing? Like, I don't, aside from, and then he also is like, it's not a state, it's an action. I think he says something to that effect. So like, you aren't, which I actually appreciate that intervention somewhat, because I do think that the way we use anti-racist, it becomes an identity. Like, I am an anti-racist, which is kind of odd because the book is like called How to Be an Anti-Racist, but in the text he actually says it's something you do. It's not like who you are. But I do think that is an important component. But if you're not gonna like define racism and then like lambast people for not like explicitly being anti-racist, then I'm like, I don't really know where to go from there.
yeah, it's well, I think that dichotomy, the whole anti-racism is not an identity, and also really, according to S. Kennedy, racism shouldn't be an identity either, and he does say that. I
Yeah.
mean, when I first heard X Kennedy, I actually found him refreshing from the prior generation of this thought. When everyone got,
In
huh?
the origin, who would be considered like,
Oh, just like the power plus privilege people.
oh, got it. Like, okay, got it.
Like he does seem, if you're dealing with that end of radical thought, he does seem refreshing.
Okay.
But that, the one thing I'll say about that school of thought is, outside of some graduate students who took it onto blogs in the aught teens,
Mm-hmm.
that school of thought never was popular with the
Mm-hmm.
broad public. That was something that activists on campuses would throw at you.
Right.
And I think Ex Kendi was popular with the broad public in that this was adopted in newsrooms, it was adopted in the academy. It became a large part of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion movements. And for a little bit after the Floyd protests, rebellions, whatever you want to call them, it really seemed like that became the dominant way to talk about race. And I found it interesting because right before the Floyd moment, there was beginning to be a backlash to Robin DiAngelo
Mm-hmm.
that was forestalled by the Floyd moment.
Right.
So, and a backlash not from the right, from like both liberals like Jonathan Chait and leftists who were like, well, what is this really about? It seems like ultimately we have come back to that. Like, it seems like DiAngelo is no longer, broadly speaking, popular outside of academia
Yeah,
anymore.
she had to get one last like I was gonna say one last scam, but you remember she had that other book called Nice White People, where she
Mm-hmm.
was saying that it's not like the Charlottesville racists that you should be worried about. It's like the nice white people that you work with, or the nice white people like in the classes with you at school that you should really be worried about. The ones that know all the right keywords and all the things. Those are the real racists that we should be looking out for, which it didn't quite grab on the way that White Fragility did. So I don't know, maybe she had just, captured the zeitgeist and then that was it for her. But I thought it was interesting that that book also didn't catch on in the academy the way that, or not
Right.
necessarily the academy, but let's say it, I know you hate this term, in PMC circle.
Yes, I do hate this term, but I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I have learned that I'm going to just give up on fighting that battle as long as people concede to me that it doesn't meet my definition of a Marxist theory of class, and then we're just going to like never the twain shall meet. Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get mad about it. But you're right. It did become, what I find interesting, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit. Is diversity, equity, and inclusion grew everywhere very fast, but in the private sector, it seemed to rise and fall like within a year almost, just like, whereas I think in the academy, except in states that explicitly ban it, which there's going to be more than a few probably, it has largely fallen away. So much so that I was just at BYU recently,
Mhm.
which, outside of places like Liberty University, is one of the most reactionary universities in the country.
Yeah.
And yet they didn't call it DEI because that's bad, but it was like, I think it was diversity, inclusion, and belonging, like
Mhm.
DIB. And I'm like, so even they feel like they have to come up with something equivalent to it
Right.
on a college campus now. And
Yeah.
that's in like the most conservative end of the LDS church.
Yeah. I feel like DEI is so there's a pretty good book about this out of sociology called The Diversity Bargain.
Mm-hmm.
And the author, I can't, her name is escaping me right now, but it came out maybe in like 2018, 2019. But she pretty much interviews college students about their feelings on like racial diversity. And one of like the modal responses is that people are like, yeah, we like diversity because it's something I can put on my resume or it's something I can like talk about during my interview. So it's become its own set of like cultural capital, especially for like, upwardly mobile like white kids who probably are not going to be embedded in any spaces where they're going to like meaningfully interact with Black people, but being able to speak the language somewhat, I think, is part of the reason that even some of the more reactionary or let's say not as progressive institutions are willing to go with it because it is viewed as like oh, I can check this box off, which is a very cynical way to think about its use. But I think that that's kind of how it's being done. But I also wanted to add one other thing you said about DEI. It also feels like the whole multicultural thing is coming back too, which is kind of odd because I feel like that had been done by like the middle of the Bush presidency, Bush 2 presidency. But I've seen a couple like like not ads, like flyers and things where people explicitly say multicultural, and I'm like, that kind of, it's interesting that that's kind of returning. I don't know if you've seen
Oh,
that.
I've seen that actually. One of the things I think is driving that is that it's acceptable to conservative discourse. So, like in Utah and
Uh,
public schools, like we use that language. We don't use DEI language. We talk about inclusion, but we don't talk about equity. Um, and we talk about multicultural diversity again and cultural awareness. And because it if you're maybe this is specific to Utah, but if you're like an LDS and you're a religious minority in the rest of the country, but like you're also a majority here, um, and the LDS church is kind of particular because their history so recent. They're really concerned about being viewed as racist, like a lot. Unlike a whole lot of evangelicals who just don't really care. I mean, they kind of care, but they don't care. Like the Southern Baptist Convention is not losing sleep over it most of the time. Let's put it that way. So maybe it's unique to here, but I've seen that language being adopted here.
yeah.
Um, there's also a sense in which, like, in a place like Utah, like Black female LDS conservatives, that's like a surefire way to get in the Congress.
Yeah. Then
Um,
there was the one what's her name? She was in Congress from Utah.
Representative Love, yeah.
Yeah. She got ousted though, right? Or she's
Yeah, she got ousted, but we have several more in the wings.
oh, okay.
Like,
So
also, yeah, in Utah, weirdly, uh, if you're a white dude, you're likely to be senator. But if you're like a junior congressperson, being a person of color and preferably a woman seems to be the way to go. And this phenomenon isn't new. It's just like back in the day when you go watch the DNC, you'd see a whole lot of like the same three black people. I mean, not the DNC, the RNC. You'd see the same three black people on the camera over and over again. But there is a way in which there's an anxiety about this in conservative circles, particularly post-Trump, where we want to double down on reaction, and even like we're even okay with being pretty bigoted on LGBT rights to ways we weren't recently. Like
Right.
I've seen reversals to back to aughts talking points about even gay marriage.
Oh wow.
But what they don't want to do is seem particularly racist, and I think there's just frankly cynical demographic reasons tied into class about this.
Mm-hmm.
Their class coalition of upper middle class petite bourgeois business owners is actually largely the GOP's base, to be in a lot of ways. Is more and more of color. It just is like, and so I think that, and you've kind of seen this also, I think, in the way, and this will get us to maybe how we talk about this political economy aspect of it with Biden, but like for most of my 30s, and I'm gathering probably a good deal of yours too. I don't know your age, but I'm assuming it's a little bit younger than me, but not a lot.
I'm 35.
Yeah, okay, so you would have come of age during this time. There's been an assumption that racial demographics alone ensured Democratic victory. And there's been a realization that educational status is even more predictive of whether or not one votes as a Democrat than race. And that there's been a decoupling, like people go, oh, well, conservatives have always been stupid. Actually, it's only recently that that graduate degree holders are almost to a person Democrats. That's a generation and a half phenomenon.
Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to include in the paper you where I mentioned, kind of laid out the privatization, was that educational kind of chasm. But I had to cut it because journals have a very hard word cap, and so I made use of the footnotes as much as I could. But that's definitely something that I feel like does not get talked about enough.
Well, how does education play into this role of the privatization of racial responsibility?
Yeah, so like one thing that I think is super fascinating, and did you familiar with like Barbara Ehrenreich's work, right?
Yeah, I am.
So in one of her most interesting books to me is the Fear of Falling book. She talks about how the middle class is kind of psychologically unstable. Like they're always so worried about like upward mobility and like status and recognition and all these things in a way that is kind of leads them to some degree of almost psychosis. But one of the things that I thought was so fascinating about her is about this text is there was one of the chapters where she was talking about the 1968 presidential election, and she was saying that we have this idea that like the Southern strategy, Nixon imposed it, and just like this overnight kind of switch. And what she shows is like, no, actually highly educated, especially white people, were voting Republican even throughout like this period. Like the Southern strategy was not even aimed at them for like white professional, white collar whites. But once it became clear that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had more or less like aligned on financial issues, or at least transitioning into a finance capitalist society, then there was really nothing to contest or really to debate about on that end. And so as a result, like you start seeing more and more white professionals who are now really interested in like some of these questions of multicultural whatever. And I thought that was really fascinating because I think there is a way that we tend to think like all of this kind of happens at once without thinking about, oh, it actually matters that we have an asset-based economy, and for a lot of these people, like that's not an issue that they're willing to like talk about. And so it really significantly like narrows down like the areas that you can contest like politically. And so I think that matters, especially for my framework, because what I'm trying to say is that, well, if we have come to understand like Black or racial justice, at least some of it, as being, oh, well, Black people have to, have some access to property and generation, and we talk about the racial wealth gap and all that stuff. Well, that's kind of a problem because part of having an asset-based economy is that you have to have some people who are like debtors and some people are creditors, and so it's like necessarily zero sum. And so what I've been saying is like, okay, we shouldn't be surprised then when a number of the issues like schooling, which always comes back to like property values or affordable whatever, like that those issues are always the one that gets shot down, because that's a situation in which people's material considerations are actually like conditioning or at least shaping the way that they understand the types of, like, let's say racial justice or anti-racist policies that they're willing to support. And so most of the research that I was originally reading on the matter chalked most of this up to, oh, well, there still must be some degree of like implicit bias, or people still must have some degree of like racial resentment towards Black people. And I'm like, that might be true, but even if we could pull out like the Men in Black, flashy thing and like make everybody like forget everything they understood about race and still had an asset-based economy, like we're probably still going to be in the same boat. And so like I just think that there's a way that thinking about the kind of the political economy of all these things helps to clarify a lot of these inequalities. But I also don't know if that's just me being a crude materialist. So,
Yeah, well, I don't know. I kind of, as a person who's a little bit of a crude materialist, just at the end of the day, I think yeah, it's very easy to explain to me. And people are like, oh, it's difficult to explain systemic racism. And I'm just like, oh, no, it's not hard. Like, all I have to do is do a multiplier by, like, your parents have money. They give you some of that money. You have more money and you continue earning money. Now, X person makes the same income as you. Their parents did not have money. Their parents also did not have money, and so forth. I think where it gets confusing, though, is there's this tendency to use a statistic about, like, quote, white people as if white people are a homogenous group in this regard, and they're not by class, and also they're also sorted by ethnic origins. There's certain last names and certain class stratas that go back to certain places.
Oh, totally.
Going very far back. I know. One of the interesting things about like my familiar background is I have some of the good last names and some of the bad last names in my immediate history. And my actual last name is very weird. So people actually can't know that much by it. But there's times I mean, you just, and I think that's interesting too. And conversely, this is true for Black people as well. If anyone's ever studied it, like, it's like there's been a Black bourgeoisie. Now, it's at a big disadvantage to the white bourgeoisie. It was shut out of, depending on where you're at, between 200 and 300 years of accumulation. That's
totally.
that's not insignificant.
Right.
But the development of a Black bourgeoisie happened even before Jim Crow ended. Actually, significantly before Jim Crow ended.
Yeah.
And I think that history does have to be understood when we talk about this, because a lot of times when we're talking about like social policy, that my favorite one is affirmative action. Who primarily benefits from that? Well, white women, for one thing.
Right.
Jews did for a while. And then, like, if it does get to Black people eventually, it's the children of these very early Black families. And then also, and this is the unfortunate rational core of ADOS complaints.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of immigrants, like, who come from very elite backgrounds in their home country. And when I tell people, like, the irony of us talking about like rich Nigerians is because our racist immigration policy means that, like, unless you're in the most pathetic of states coming over as a refugee, you're probably going to be the 1% of the 1% of those African countries you're coming from.
Yeah.
So
The affirmative action thing is so fascinating because it's a circular argument. And so this summer I'm working on a book that essentially traces how the why it is that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed. And then subsequently, like, how did that eventually lead to the creation of the Department of Education? And even thinking about like affirmative action within, so I did some archival work at the LBJ library this summer and did quite a bit of archival work at the JFK archives, because obviously those were the two administrations where most of this legislation, well, what became the ESEA was created. And for affirmative action, they're kind of, if you, I looked at like just exchanges between like LBJ and Walter Heller and some of his other advisors, and they really don't know how to define what counts as discrimination. So for them, they're like, well, the Supreme Court says that we can't look at like different demographic, kind of just how people are stratified demographically, because there's other reasons why people are, why cities are demographically structured the way they are. So that's not legitimate. And so ultimately they come up with this definition, was like discrimination is the result of like discriminatory action, which completely circular. I'm like, what do you do with that? But like the original affirmative action executive orders were specifically about actual harms that you could identify and trace and rectify in government agencies at first. And so there's I don't know if you've read this book called Inventing Equal Opportunity, which to me is like a good way of showing how it slowly morphs from very specific claims that you could clearly like litigate to after the Bakke decision, this really weird like affirmative action is fine if it leads to, if it for diverse reasons or whatever it says, which really is again kind of thinking about what I was saying earlier about like, we'll support this because there might be some social capital at stake for white kids essentially. But then now I'm just kind of like, well, what is it? Is it just DEI? It can't be quotas. We know the quotas are unconstitutional. They've been deemed unconstitutional for decades now. So if it can't be quotas, it's not DEI, I don't think. I'm like, what is it? And I've asked, I'm not an expert in affirmative action, but I've talked to people who kind of work in this domain, and I'm just so confused about like what it actually is. And what I've come to realize is people don't actually want to define what it is, because like that ambiguity is kind of what allows it to sustain itself in some ways. Because I don't think that there is a specific policy, at least not within the confines of let's say previous rulings on the matter. And so I don't know if you have any insights, but I'm just at a loss at how to even think about affirmative action in 2022.
I'm confused if this ruling change for the elite colleges of which it affects matters at all, because we still have diversity statements. We still have all these subjective criteria. In fact, one of the things that both conservatives and liberals have been doing away with, and this is a separate rant, but has been doing away with most forms of objective standards, except for stuff like subjective, like holistic background statements, which is gonna favor, and does, we have evidence that it does favor the rich, even when they include stuff like diversity statements. Actually, especially when they include stuff like diversity statements, because you have to come from the right background to know what it is, to have the time and access to do the things to back it up. So you're not just saying, I value people for who they are, blah, 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 blah. Right. Like, and to prove it, like someone like me who's had the ability to travel all over the world at other people's expense, may be able to pull that off from a working class background, but most people cannot. Right. And I think that's one thing that ties me to it. The other thing that this was my whole thing about recently, or the education debate around this, and this privatization argument that you make that got me really thinking, is that there's also a way one, the idea that we're going to fix education through its top elite end, to me, that makes no sense. Like, two, while I am totally sympathetic to the systemic bias in standardized testing, ACT, SAT, definitely IQ tests, because they're always in a language, and a language you have to pick a dialect, and that dialect's always going to have cultural and social implications once you pick it. There's really no way around that, actually.
Yeah. Totally.
The fact of the matter is, everything I've ever read on grading indicates that it's actually even more given towards systemic bias, even down to precise skin tone variation, which you do not see in the ACT or SAT, which means that the people who are arguing this as a fix to systemic biases, just, they either are ignorant on what the actual data says, or they are frankly dishonest. And one of the things that has been sitting in the back of my head to tie this into the political economy of this is, while yes, there has been more racial diversity at both elite and upper tier public universities in the last decade, there's been less economic diversity. And when you add to this second fact, it still remains that, for example, the number of Black people at the poverty line has largely been unchanged since 2007. Then what do we have? I mean, it seems to me that you have to explain, well, either the educational benefit is not working, or the most disadvantaged people of color are not getting the advantages from these programs, or both. Like, so.
Well, I think the part of the issue is that people don't have actual, what's the aim? Like, what are you actually trying to do? Is it, do we just want proportional representation? Or in terms of like, oh, well, if, I think, you know, like Adolf Reed has talked about this, like, is racial justice just making sure that, you know, the amount of homeless, it's 13% homeless are Black, 40 whatever, why is that what it means? Or does it, like, it's never clear to me what it means. And there's also a way in which I feel like we live so much in the abstractions that we don't understand that there are many things that could be done for vast majority of Black people, even if that wouldn't, and caution to Sandy Darity if he's watching, even if that means the racial wealth gap won't be closed. I'm like, if we, I don't know, let's just throw a policy out. Let's say universal healthcare. I'm not saying that's the solution. I think that there's a way that people on the left like tend to think of it as a panacea, but obviously, like, I don't think anyone should go into bankruptcy behind universal healthcare. But even not leaving an appointment and having to pay, whatever absurd amount for like some routine procedure, it seems like it could go a long way to helping Black people, even if in the abstract, even in terms of the statistics, like we may not be seeing like that much of these gaps closing. And I think part of that is like, well, we have a market economy under capitalism, which means that there has to be some inequality. And so like, do we only care about like closing the racial aspects? And I'm just like, well, I don't know how you even do that without engaging with having an asset economy. Like if you look at all of the interest, like people are making wealth, people who have the wealth to put in like some high yield savings or whatever, like this is only exacerbating the same disparities that the disparities people are always talking about, but there's never any mention of those things. And part of the reason I'm so fascinated by education is because we just expect it to solve everything. Like we expect it to solve racial wealth gap, we expect it to solve mental health issues, we expect it to solve literally everything. And I'm just like, but it can't do that unless you actually, well, it can't do that, but until we actually reckon with those other things, like I don't know what people want from it. And so I don't know if it's a lack, if it's ignorance, or if it's just I tend to think it's more of a people just don't understand how this economy works. And so because they don't understand how the economy works, like I do think that people believe very strongly in like equal opportunity. And I'm just like, equal opportunity essentially just means equal opportunity for everyone to be exploited on the market. Like that's what that means in effect. But yeah, so I don't know what people are thinking about. What's the aim of some of these policies?
I was going to ask you then. This takes us to the Biden economy. Friend of the show, Freddie DeBoer, told me the other day. Well, when I interviewed him, I guess about a month ago, that he thought that the economy was doing rather well under Biden. And my response, which I suppressed to be fair, was like, I can tell your Substack's doing well. So because I'm like, in abstract, it is true that the GDP growth is not bad right now.
Right.
It is also true that broad basket inflation, not including everything that's important, housing, education, and food, has gone back to its 3 to 4% range. Food's still kind of bad, which disproportionately affects poor people. When I saw the Seth Ackerman, Aaron Benyev debates around this, single majority report, I kind of sided with Benyev that it's not that for the majority of people, since actually the Obama recovery, the consolidation of assets and wealth is such that even if the general economy is doing okay, most people do not actually experience that benefit, and they do experience both the indebtedness, which has gone up dramatically. It went down significantly during the beginning of COVID, but that's all been undone.
Right.
And they also experience inflation. And there was a lot of assumptions that since inflation is good for debt holders, that it would be broadly speaking good for the poor. And there's some truth to that, but not a lot. Because the lower down you are on the poverty rate, and if you don't own your own home, you actually, and if you're not college educated to talk about these quote PMC issues, you probably actually aren't that affected in ways that you can see by, the cost of debt.
Right.
You are affected by it, but it's not something that you see.
Right.
So how do you think Bidenomics is actually doing?
So I live in Philadelphia, and I can say not well. So like you said, I think that for I wouldn't even say just the top 1%, probably like the top 10 to 15%. Like the top 1%, you probably don't register any difference at all because you're just so wealthy. The next like 15%, okay, you might be annoyed that you used to be able to have paid $12 or 10. I'm in Philly, so maybe $10 for a craft cocktail, but now you pay 14. Like, sure, you might be annoyed by that, but like it's not gonna like systematically change your behavior in really any meaningful way. Now, below that, it gets tricky because yes, we have GDP growth, but I think I wrote a Twitter thread about that. But if you actually look at where most of the growth is, it's in finance, it's in real estate, it's in insurance. Like, and so, yeah, like, but these are things that people have to have. Like, you can't not have. Most states don't. Isn't it illegal not to have car insurance in many states?
And almost
So
all of them, yes.
yeah, exactly. Right. That's what I thought. Yeah. And so like the things that so it annoys me so much, especially when I read the Wall Street Journal, because they're like, oh, like, why isn't like the interest rate like curbing people's spending? And I'm like, yeah, because they're spending most of their fucking money on like insurance and healthcare and like education. Like it's not like they're just going to Gucci and like making it rain. I mean, they might be, but I don't think that's what's doing most of the driving. And so I think there's a way that because we don't actually tease out like finance from like other product act like literally productive, like producing some type of like I guess you could say money. I'm not gonna get into is money a commodity thing, but people like things that you could actually like I don't know, like touch that even I guess that you could do that with money too. But you see, you get what I'm saying. But like the fact
I also like strategically know how you're avoiding all the like nasty pitfall questions that
right,
might
yeah,
come
exactly.
up.
Right, exactly. Like, not tonight. But yeah. Um, yeah, I just think that there's a way that we never talk about that. And I'm just like, well, that's part of the reason also that privatization of the economy was such a big deal, because capitalists knew that if you could privatize things that people actually needed, or privatize like natural monopolies, then it would be an infinite amount. You could pretty much raise the price for what as much as you wanted, and like people were going to pay it, not because they didn't, because they were, whatever, because they had to. And so I just think that we really have like probably 3 or 4 economies for people, but because all of our statistics are so aggregated, it's so hard to see kind of the way that they kind of break. And so that's what I've been trying to figure out. And then specifically with Black people, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, which I have all sorts of issues with the Wall Street Journal, but in my opinion, it's the only paper in the United States where you can get at least halfway decent economic data, or reporting, I should say.
Yeah, I normally have to go to the Financial Times because
Yeah, I read the
not
Financial.
as good as it used to be. However, it's still like if you throw out every gloss in the Wall Street Journal, I used to say just throw out the editorial page. Now I'm like, throw out everything except for the stats.
Right.
The stats are good. Like,
right. Exactly. So there was an article maybe about a month ago saying that Black people, because they are overrepresented in most of the service sector, so even like in what do you call it when you have like health, like home health aides and things like that, because they're overrepresented in those areas, and because these are areas where you've actually seen some of the strongest like wage growth, like they are disproportionately benefiting from a lot of the wage growth that Jerome Powell is probably fuming about right now. And so, but that just never, I feel like that doesn't enter the discourse often. It's still like, but uh, it's still like the racial wealth gap stuff, which again, it's important, but like, this is actually like one of the few times when like Black working people are actually doing somewhat better than the average person in terms of like relatively. Like we could still talk about all of the indebtedness and all of those things, which are obviously important, but by that one metric, there is some evidence which suggests that, and I feel like it just never gets brought up.
Yeah, I crunched the numbers on the racial wealth gap once at the request of my friend Colin Drum, who said that I was too flippant about it. So I crunched it, and I saw that it was real, and it was real between working class people too. But I pointed out to him I could explain it in one sentence when I looked at what it was, and I was like, "It's the results of 2007."
Mm-hmm.
It's still the results of 2007. The difference is the number of white people versus the number of Black people that were able to hold on to their mortgages because of predatory lending prices in the aughts. And that is still primarily what's driving the wealth gap. And I pointed to Colin, I was like, the wealth gap isn't even the difference of a house. It's
Right.
like half of the average value of a house.
Right.
And so I'm like, so I was like, so when we look at indebtedness and whatnot, we have to assume there's probably a difference. Black people are probably slightly more indebted because they pay higher on average because of these things like the actuarial tables I was talking about at the beginning of our story today.
Right.
They pay higher for these things if they live in traditionally Black neighborhoods, in quotes. Then yes, but really that's something you could easily fix.
Right.
With, I mean, fairly radical. It's impossible to happen under current conditions, but like so are most things if we could fix it.
Yeah.
But we could easily fix with just housing policy under a capitalist economy. So
yeah,
like it's but that point you made about neoliberalism, I want to go into that because I think that's actually insightful. One, the idea, and even as a kid, when people were still selling this stuff in the 90s, that private competition and natural monopolies would lead to lower prices never made sense to me because I was like, but there's no competition. Like, you're telling me, and I see this with the cable company back then, you're telling me natural competition is going to compete and drive the prices down, but there's literally no competition. Now, there's just now a person taking a profit where priorly all you had to do was meet administrative cost. And I guess you're going to tell us because it's a profit, there's an incentive to be more efficient. But again, there's no competition. They can just raise the prices. So even as a, when I realized this, I was still a pretty diehard capitalist, to be honest with you. And I just was like, this doesn't make sense to me. And I started seeing that throughout neoliberalism. And the other thing I noticed, and I noticed this a long time ago, that this whole like we are getting rid of government and making it smaller is fundamentally not true. In fact, if anything, administrative bloat, administrative growth to look over all these fucking laws that govern these public-private partnerships had led to a significant increase in the size of the government purely for administrative costs.
Right.
Like,
yeah, and the other thing that I feel like also doesn't get discussed much, or maybe not enough, especially not in the mainstream, is that one of the other added benefits of this privatization of like natural monopolies, so letting some private company come manage like the water system in your town or whatever, is when shit breaks down, like the government, local government has to fix it. Like they're not really usually responsible for the maintenance and the upkeep. But because we don't have really any reasonable fiscal policy, which I feel like is something that also doesn't get discussed enough, all cities typically end up doing is issuing bonds and taking rich people's money to solve the issue. So it's in paying them interest to fix the issues that the private company should, in theory, be responsible for. So it's great because you can offload all of the costs associated with the management or the distribution of the item or the whatever it is in question. And you don't have to pay for any of the management and upkeep. And when something has to be done for it, the city has to come to rich people for the money to actually repair it, and they have to pay them interest. And so, because we don't raise taxes on anybody really, but especially not the wealthy. And so I feel like that's like especially in local governments, like I look at Philadelphia, and the city is right now doing okay financially because they kind of set on quite a bit of the federal money they got from like the CARES package and stuff, but that's going to run out fairly soon. And Philadelphia does not have the type of tax base to offset the money that they would have gotten from the federal government. And so what's going to happen? Like, aside from them having to fall back on bond issuance, which obviously is strings attached, like usually leads to some more austerity in a city that's already suffering both with like the opiate crisis as well as like all other types of things associated with social decay. And so I just feel like the privatization aspect is, and then tying this back to racial inequality, if we care about disparities, like if you are somebody who is on the we need to be concerned about closing racial disparities, these are things that you should be concerned about, because this is going to disproportionately harm Black people in Philadelphia, but not only Black people, but if you care about the disproportionality, it's going to disproportionately harm people in places like Philadelphia or other cities where Black people are kind of concentrated. So yeah, the political economy just can't escape it. Like, it's such a key part of understanding like racial inequality to me.
Absolutely. I want to pull this apart a little bit because I think this is actually a great thing to think about when we're talking about the problems with this. I've been talking about municipal bonds as a way to discipline through three public corporations, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch's, to discipline what governments can even do. If you look at I think about a lot of like the most progressive mayoral cities in the country. Not, Chicago is one of them now, but look like Jackson, Mississippi. And Jackson, Mississippi, God bless Mayor Lumumba, but it's a hellhole.
Yeah.
And why? The legislature won't fund it, and no way he's getting good bond rates. So anything that they do costs them way more. And since we have a particular, as I've told people before, the federal government is basically an insurance company that kills people. In that it is a military, and it is a backstop shitty insurance company that somehow, despite the fact we don't have socialized medicine, managed to waste more money than even the most inefficient socialized medicine I've ever heard of.
But highly profitable.
Yeah, right. It is highly profitable for somebody, but not for the federal government. but it has currency sovereignty. As long as it has relative power over international trade. I'm not a pure MMT, I think you might know that about me.
Yeah.
But I am sort of a international balance of powers MMT, in that if you have the ability to force people to buy shit in your currency, you do pretty much you have within limits a whole lot of power over the amount of currency you have floating around, and debt can even help you as in a way as a government, in a way it would not help an individual or a state, because the states do not have that kind of currency sovereignty, cannot have that kind of currency sovereignty, both constitutionally, and they're just not big enough. I guess like if California was independent from the United States and New York, maybe it could pull something, but in general, they cannot. So to tie this all back around, what people miss is most of the important things in your life are funded at the municipal and state level, where these kinds of financial controls are the most powerful. That is one of the reasons why, despite that, if you look at all levels of tax burden in the United States, one of the reasons why we're hesitant to raise taxes is because we're taxed by a lot of different levels of government, honestly. Like when I actually crunch that, when people are like, oh, Europe has so much higher taxes, I'm like, they do, but it's not quite as much higher as you think. Because you're just looking at your Social Security, Medicare, and income tax, but let's look at the broad gamut of taxes and fees that you actually pay.
Especially fees now.
Yes.
I got funny story. I got charged. I went to a concert earlier this summer. I got charged a printing fee for a PDF ticket. That's how crazy, outrageous the fees have gotten for Ticketmaster.
Oh my God. I've made a mistake of flying one of the two budget airlines to Atlanta, and I had to talk to a counter person, and I had to do it in a very particular way, not to be charged $50 to talk to the person that I was going to have to talk to anyway. But yeah, it's just like, what? That's ridiculous. I do kind of miss the libertarians when they used to talk about all those things as backdoor taxes, because in some ways they are, both privately and publicly. Like there's also like, I'm like, you don't hear about as in other countries, at least not other developed countries, as many people going bankrupt from court fees.
Yeah.
So like,
yeah, I mean, they pretty much are private tax. I mean, it's just taxes on the services that private industry is distributing.
And the reason why they're able to distribute is because they have a government fiat to do so, because it's not like they're actually competing on the open market. So like again, you would think, and I tell many stories about the complex way of things that make me a socialist. But one of them, one of the many, was realizing that I didn't understand why libertarians liked insurance, and I didn't understand why libertarians like public-private partnership, because from their own theoretical mechanism, they should never support that. In fact, that's actually the worst of both worlds from their own thinking. It is rent seeking, rent large.
Right.
Like, and then when you realize that, you're just like, oh, they don't mean shit. Like, and the ones that do aren't taken seriously. I did occasionally meet libertarians who'd argue against like public-private partnerships and also even the concept of insurance, like, and stuff like that. But they were never the ones anyone listened to.
Right.
Like, I don't want to say that there was nobody who was consistent, but it was pretty rare. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, and I think most people realize that. Even reactionaries don't tend to be libertarians anymore. So it does tend to put to lie this. But it also, interestingly, I think this is important for people misunderstanding how neoliberalism works, or whatever we're in right now. I tend to think we're in the transition between neoliberalism and something else.
Yeah, we're in a little state. It feels like we're kind of trying to revert back to Keynesianism without fiscal policy. Honestly, I actually want to talk to you about that, because in doing some of my archival work this summer, one thing that kept coming up was how the Economic Council of Advisors for both Kennedy and LBJ were adamant about like you can't just have monetary policy without like some active fiscal policy. So sure, like they were concerned about like deficit spending and so on, but it was in tandem with, well, what are we going to be doing on the fiscal side? Obviously, LBJ kind of lost his grip with that with Vietnam, but like the Kennedy administration was pretty adamant about that. And I feel like what Biden is trying to do is ultimately have Keynesianism without any fiscal policy, or at least no actual explicit fiscal policy.
But this is, this is the I'm going to use rational core of truth of things a lot tonight. People, sorry. This is the rational core of the truth behind the Brenner-Riley thesis. I don't like the Brenner-Riley thesis a super lot, but their whole political capitalism, I don't really know what they mean by that, but this idea that profit rates are actually decided by governmental fiat right now in some ways due to like lending preferences and government contracts, I think is actually somewhat true. Like there's one of the reasons why the tech sector, which if you like just look at it on paper, you're just like, how in the fuck would anyone ever make any money at this? Like it just doesn't make sense. And lo and behold, when the beginnings of this squeeze hit after COVID, when they actually started getting rid of QE, it didn't make sense.
Right.
Later on, some other stuff started paying out. They started getting yields back on the bonds. That's the other thing about the debt cost. The government does have to pay out the yields on the bonds somewhere, and someone's going to get it.
But now because the stocks are falling, so it's
right. But what you just realize is like, oh, those profits were only possible in some ways, not because and I know this is where MMT is getting mad at me, but not because QE was actually pumping tons of money into the economy in a direct way, because it was actually protecting asset prices and basically diffusing asset bombs.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. So venture capital, which in other scenarios in no way made sense, became a risk worth taking if you could leverage it off the cost of debt. Right. Now you can't do that, and so other means have emerged. It also, got rid of all that excess money going into weird stuff like crypto and other things that just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so, the GameStop one was especially weird.
That was
nowhere.
But I think, I think that really is interesting. And just to tie this into race, in the beginning of the Biden economy, there was still a talk of, what was it like? I think this is right before actually Biden, but maybe it was during it. There's so much it's hard for me to remember now because the last 3 years have been so everything changes every 6 months.
Right.
And yet nothing changes at all simultaneously.
Exactly.
But like Spike Lee shilling crypto as a way for Black people to get out of like reliance on racist institutions, and I was like, I just was shocked. I'm just like, in what world does this make any sense? Particularly if the financial infrastructure and all the excess money that goes into making this viable, these only work as long as people are pumping money into it, goes away.
Right. So, E. Franklin Frazier, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He had a really scathing critique of what he calls the black bourgeoisie. But he means it in jest. Like he's essentially like, these are people who think they're bourgeoisie, but they're really just like not really petty bourgeois. Or obviously you would use like PMC, but what he says in that is like, yeah, there's been this talk about like, buy Black and Black banks and all of this. He's just like, but there is no way that can exist outside of the broader financial system. And he's writing about this in the 50s. But there's been this kind of like through line in Black thought, probably really going back to like the late 19th century, where people tend to believe that it is possible to have like a kind of a sealed off financing arena specifically for Black affairs, whatever that is, without thinking about like, well, where do y'all think banks get money? Like, what is like? I don't get. Yeah. So yeah, I just think it goes back to like a fundamental misunderstanding of like how the economy works. And I think when you start thinking about the economy and more so like a one big balance sheet as opposed to just like you know things happening in isolation, I think it becomes a lot clearer to see that the best that capitalism can often do is rob Peter to pay Paul oftentimes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely true. And this is one of your points when you were talking about there's a way in which asset economies, since they require debt,
Right.
like they are in some sense way more zero sum than traditional productive economies, which now to put my Marxist hat back on, I always say, like, look, the tendency of the rate of profits to fall, I'm not sure actually exists in the economy as a whole. But you
Yeah.
know what I do know it exists for? Produced commodities where there is no capital exclusion, by there's no patent or anything limiting the market access.
Mm-hmm.
Look at food, etc. Those profit rates are low.
Yeah.
Um, and thus it's hard to get investment to renew them, as I pointed out back during the great formula shutdownage and some of the food crises have been getting 2011. I mean 2011, 2021 and 2012. God, I'm getting old. Um, uh, is that there's such low investment in those, thus there's like a lot of these key world commodities where there's like 4 factories and that's it. And anything at all could cause a major supply disruption, because there's so low profit margin in the production, there's also no money in storing it. So like there's no reason to keep backup supplies, because warehousing is going to eat what little bit of your profit margin that there is. And it also on a small level is part of why I've talked about like the petty bourgeoisie of the Republican base seems so much more reactionary than it used to be. And that is because a lot of them do exist in retail spaces where there's actually a very low profit margin and the taxes really do hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so they don't get it. Whereas the old petty bourgeoisie, which a lot of whom have now been professionalized, and I would say semi-proletarianized. This is my longue durée critique of the PMC thesis. It's like, well, a lot of these people that we talk of as PMC, what they are people who used to have petty bourgeois relations
Mm-hmm.
and now have wage relations, semi-proletarianized relations, but are protected by things like state contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Like either as direct state workers, academics, or in things like tech and stuff where like government contracts are a great bulk of the things keeping these businesses afloat.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, they have been both proletarianized and lost their petit bourgeois prestige, but also they don't really care if taxes are high. They can probably pay it because they're going to get the money back anyway. It's almost like circular for them in some ways.
Yeah.
Like it's like contributing to your own job fund.
Right.
So and so I think when people like want to see why elite politics in America is so weird, and we're not talking about the 1% here. I think you're right. We're talking about the top 20%,
Yeah.
maybe top 30%.
Yeah.
And then there's people in the borderline like teachers and nurses and like educated, credentialed, and carteled people, but who don't keep up with inflation, etc. Like those people are weird, even under the PMC strata stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's my other critique with the thesis is like it doesn't really explain what teachers and nurses and stuff do. But bracketing those things aside and not worrying about my technical critique of the PMC thesis, there's a real sense in which there's a petit bourgeois which is doing okay. It's but really doesn't have high profit margins. And then there's a professional class which is also doing okay, but doesn't have to care about profit margins at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the competition for the voting bases of the parties right now.
Right.
And that's where all the interest goes. And so it doesn't surprise me that it seems like the Republicans have a weird petit bourgeois problem and the Democrats have a weird professional problem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where do Black people and poor people and working class people fit into this? Well, it depends on their class strata, frankly. But one of the things that you have pointed out, and I think this is another small issue with the PMC thesis, is a lot of Black people, and specifically, not just people of color, specifically Black people, because the anti-discrimination laws were well enforced in federal and state agencies,
Mm-hmm.
are in cartelized labor that has benefited from government investment.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said. And so, I mean, when people ask me like, well, then why are Black, if Democrats aren't always great for Black people, why are Black people loyal? I'm like, because like Democrats run their workplaces kind of
Right.
like it just like there's a real like I always point out to people like there's a reason why in the places where Black people could vote in the United States for FDR that they didn't vote for FDR in the first term, but they did in the other two. Like, and that's because the Public Works Administration got a lot of people jobs unless they were in the Jim Crow South.
Right.
So
now, one thing that is fascinating to me, and there's a really good book in political science that talks, which I don't say this often, but there's a really good book in political science called Steadfast Democrats. And what it's all about is like, how is it that Black people have stayed so committed to the Democratic Party as a bloc? And one thing they point to is like, you can't underestimate how important like social institutions are within the Black community. And I'd use that term, I don't love it, but for lack of a better term, like the Black community. And so one thing that I've been thinking about is if what is one thing that is like, let's say, customary of neoliberalism is kind of this atomization. We have seen even in among Black people, like Black people typically attended church more frequently than most other racial groups. They're pretty much falling to similar levels now, especially post COVID. Even the matriculation in like Black sororities and fraternities is trending downward. All these institutions that have been so integral to making that connection between the Democratic Party and voting behavior among Black people is in some ways starting to splinter. So one thing I'm wondering is like, what's on the other side of that? Now we know that there is somewhat of a cultural sphere among Black Americans. So Black Twitter is a very real thing.
absolutely.
But that needs to skew much more towards our favorite word again, the Black PMC, than it does, let's say, Black and poor and working people. And so I wonder, how are Black working people and Black poor people, or how are they going to be interacting with some of the upper strata of Black America with the splintering of these institutions, which were in many ways transcended class? Like I went to I grew up a fairly middle class, comfortable upbringing, but my church had people who were petty bourgeois Blacks. There were Black PMCs. There were Black working people who worked at the chemical plants. I mean, there was pretty much everybody in kind of similar shared space, explicitly political. But that's starting to disintegrate some. And so is it going to be the case? And obviously these things take time to filter through the society, but I wonder in, let's say, 10 or 20 years, like what will Black politics look like? Will we start to see, my hunch is I don't think that even among some of the more, let's say, Black capitalists who still vote for the Democratic Party because the Republican Party is just so overtly racist, what I think you'll start to see more is probably just like complete people just defect, like they just don't participate in voting at all. I think that's probably a more likely outcome than, because I've seen some people say, oh, well, Black men seem to be voting more for Republican Party. And I'm like, I don't know how much of that was a Trump effect or a Republican. It's kind of hard to know because people are looking at data from the two presidential elections. And so I'd be curious to see, especially if Trump is not the nominee, how this will compare. But I do think that that's something that we should be thinking about in terms of like black politics in relationship to the Democratic Party.
Traditionally, black men mostly sit on their hands, right?
Right.
Like when we talk about the black voter, we're mostly talking about fairly well-educated black women.
Right. Yeah.
Like, not completely true. I mean, there's a big inner city poverty vote, like,
where there's like legacy machines and stuff, like in Chicago or
right,
even in Philadelphia, like the black turnout among like even the lower stratas tends to be higher than other places I've lived. Definitely in the South, for sure.
Although, like, as I always like to point out, it was a black congressional caucus that got the Dixiecrat machines when they all changed their party to R.
Yeah,
like that's. And I lived through that happening, and it's just like it's very weird talking to people who grew up in the Obama era, and they're just like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "The South was Democratic until 2000 at the state level."
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Southern Louisiana. I mean, we had, I think, David Vitter, if anyone remembers him, he was like the first Republican senator that I think Louisiana had since, I believe, since Reconstruction. Like it had been solidly Democratic throughout that whole time, and now a Democrat has no chance of winning any statewide office in Louisiana.
Although Louisiana and Georgia, our two respective states, are weird in that there's still some chance that Democrats can kind of do state level politics there because of
not in Louisiana anymore. The Democrats have pretty much all but abandoned ship in Louisiana. It's gotten it's looking more like Mississippi now. I would say that was true up until Obama, but since Obama, like, well, obviously we had John Bell Edwards, but I think that was a one-off thing because David Vitter was just such a terrible candidate.
The thing is, like, for example, with Georgia, the hard thing to explain is, okay, so the state nationally goes for Democrats, but it's actually affected state level politics not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's been like, it's not like the suburbs of Atlanta are sending black representatives to the state house or voting for Stacey Abrams.
Right.
But even if they are voting for black senators, at the national level, and I don't know why, but I suspect it's because I remember after 2020, everyone was like thanking Atlanta for giving Georgia to Democrats, and I was like, Atlanta's always a black Democratic city. So's Macon, so's Savannah, so's Columbus. Even Columbus is a little bit more questionable because there's a military base there. But like,
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that some of what has happened in Metro Atlanta is a lot of the more like Cobb County areas, which used to be more right wing, have become more of the white. Again, our favorite term, PSC areas that tend to vote because of the DEI stuff, essentially.
Yeah, and also like there's been an influence of like Middle Eastern and Asian immigrants to that area, but when I say that, do not picture poor people.
Yeah,
these are specialty visa people, and so. Like in Decatur, especially, but yeah, Cobb County, Cummings had a mayor of color, I believe in the early 2010s, and for people who don't know Georgia, which is most of my audience, ironically, even though I'm from there, Cummings used to be a sundown town, like that used to be a whole lot of Cobb County. I was born in the 80s. It wasn't that way in the 80s, but it was living memory when I was a kid. We talked about it. We knew about it. It was, and I remember, this is so unfair, and I have an advantage as I'm from the South, but people watching Lovecraft Country and learning what a sundown town was. And I was like, and they're not old.
Yeah. I knew ours was Vidor, Texas, which is about 40, not even 40, maybe like 30 miles from my hometown. And I vividly remember my mom telling me when I was like a young kid that if you need to go to the bathroom, you need to go before we get to cross the state line, pretty much, because there were no rest stops between Vidor and Beaumont, which is like the next major city. So 20 miles for a 4 or 5 year old kid could that could be the difference between an accident and so yeah, I was all too familiar with sundown towns for sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's I think I was more shocked at the it was well-meaning right liberals and then very young and very educated black people that I knew. To be
Yeah,
honest, it was
I had a question about county. So is it more so like what happened to the, let's say, the more of the Gingrich type Republicans? Are they still there and just are outnumbered now, or have they moved elsewhere?
some of them are still there and outnumbered. Some of them have moved further north into the mountains into Marjorie Taylor Greene's district,
Oh,
which
I
is
see.
up there in the foothills, which used to be poor people, but is now one of the most expensive places to live
Oh, wow.
in Georgia. So one of the things that's really changed in my lifetime, the lower Appalachia, when I was a kid, had only had power for 10 years.
Wow.
Like they were that late at like, but in the 90s, it went from basically impoverished stick people, uh, and rednecks in the old sense of the term,
Mm,
into uh, luxury homes for people who wanted a vacation in the mountains,
mm,
and people commuting in from running away from Atlanta by living up in the hills. And so there was a pretty dramatic shift in the voting population there. Um, and conversely, the center of the state, which went from like 55% white, 45% black, went to like 60-70% black. And also conversely, since these areas were ungentrified, like if you just go to Macon, like half the cities run down. It's mostly turned to churches and hospitals. There's no tax base, etc.
mhm.
Um, and so there's a lot of that where I grew up, and actually it was an issue when I first became a leftist because the way that people would talk about gentrification and stuff, I'd just be like, well, if you don't gentrify these neighborhoods, what are we going to do? Because there's like they become dilapidated shitholes.
Mhm.
So because the way this is so privatized, if you don't have money coming in, which means that people with money have to come in, then how do you revitalize this? And again, journey to becoming a socialist, that became my answer. But it was just like the anti-gentrification movement in and of itself, particularly as it existed in the late aughts through the aught teens, was just like totally insufficient for what I was seeing, and tend to be like, oh, you're talking about inner city areas and like the rich part of the country. You're not talking
Mhm.
about poor urban areas in the Midwest or the South.
No,
Like,
gentrification, I've just come to realize or accept that it's just a signifier. Like people typically just use it to mean like uh a certain type of white person. I don't know, one who is okay maybe paying 6.25 for a coffee at Starbucks. Like that's pretty much all that means. It's not grounded in anything dealing with political economy whatsoever. Like I remember I lived in Durham before I moved to Durham, North Carolina, before I moved to Philadelphia. And Durham's a up and coming southern city, so large parts of like downtown Durham are being completely overhauled with the typical gentrification markers. Like there's an axe throwing place, there's a arcade bar, there's a coffee shop and everything. Literally
all the
all
stuff though that like you'd want to do.
right.
Like,
Yeah, like I love it. I had like three of my favorite coffee shops were all in the like concentrated in the little area. But I remember being with one of my friends and he was just like, man, like I'm just so tired of seeing like all these rich white people come in and like raise the prices and the rents and things. And I'm like, I probably shouldn't ask this, but like, why the hell not? So I was like, well, would you be okay if it were like rich black people? He was like, well, yeah, because at least they'd understand the culture. And I'm like, is that what this is about? Like, is that what this is about? I feel like with gentrification, people have a certain like again, it's a signifier, and they only focus on the cosmetic aspects of it without thinking about like the developmental side and like what it actually means from like a material standpoint.
Yeah, why are all these fail-son white people coming to your neighborhood in the first place? It's
Right.
because it's too expensive to live in the ones they used to.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
I just, it's funny to me. I do remember looking at all the stats of that, and I was like, the only thing that seems true about this is white people have to learn not to call the cops on people for petty annoyances. That does seem to be a thing that we should be talking about. That's just being a good neighbor. If your neighbor pisses you off, throw your trash in their yard. Don't actually call the cops on them.
Right.
Um,
I'm also like, if you move to Brooklyn and are mad because your neighbors are loud, like, why are you living in? Why did you move to New
yeah,
York? Like,
exactly.
that's not something you should move to New York. If you are that concerned about peace and quiet, like, that's not where you go.
Our like, you know, come to my neighborhood, which is mostly Latin, and it's pretty quiet except for holidays, in which case it's loud as hell, but you just have to deal with it.
It's pretty loud here. It's pretty quiet here too, except when Philadelphia. I have to say, I've lived a lot of places, and by far has the most passionate fan bases across all the major sports. So I will say, like I've lived here for now like a year and a half, and like all the major sports teams have done well. Like obviously, the Eagles went to the Super Bowl. The Phillies were in the World Series last year. It looked like they might be heading that way again. Even the soccer team like went to the championship. So after like big sporting events, you hear a lot. People do fireworks. Sometimes it might be gunshots. I'm never quite sure, but like there's a lot of commotion after sporting events. But other than that, like
yeah. Well, white Mormons do fireworks for a month during July, like, and then my Latin neighbors, God bless them, will use any excuse ever to do fireworks, and I can't blame him, even though I hate it. But now that we're getting into essentialized gossip, I will say I kind of want to end off on where you see a lot of this going. Now that we see like outside the academy, I think we can say DEI is pretty much washed up on the shores of the larger culture. There does seem to have been a broad cultural shift, like in entertainment. The dream of the 90s dream of every channel being superficially diverse has seemed to happen.
right.
But at the same token, everything from justice reform to talking about racial outcomes seems to have gone away. In some cases, it's because, for example, the life expectancy difference between poor white people and poor black people is shrinking, but for very disturbing and bad reasons. Mostly poor white people are dying at younger and younger ages, not black people living longer. But the gap is closing, so to
Right.
speak. And I think we've seen real change in some ways about a more diverse uh, top 20%. I think that's real. I don't think that's perceptual. Um, but on other issues such as like I still, yes, everything in New York Times is framed in the way it's going to affect racial outcomes. Everything in NPR is framed in the way it's going to affect racial outcomes. But in general, it seems like we're 1,000 years away. I mean, in the beginning, you said you felt like the George Floyd revolts didn't really do that much, except for if you're at Goldman Sachs or in the academy. Um, in a way, for me, it's like people don't even remember it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the whole vibe is gone, and we just like, oh yeah, that time when we rioted for 2 months in the middle of a pandemic, like to the point that some of my European friends thought that perhaps the U.S. government was going to collapse, which was ridiculous, but nonetheless, that's what they were seeing. Like it was just like, and now it's like, did that even happen?
Right. Yeah, it's just like what do we have to show for it? Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like one thing I've always thought was awful argument in favor of DEI, specifically at the corporate level, is when people make the argument that diversity is good for business, which I always was like, well, a corollary of that is that if business is not doing well, it's going to be really easy for them to cut it and say that we don't need to focus on this right now because it's not critical, which is exactly what happens. All these corporations, the minute that profits look like they might be in question, that's usually the first thing that goes. Now, one thing I have seen in the corporate space that, because I have quite a few friends who work in corporate spaces, especially like corporate DEI and that kind of realm, is now people are complaining because I'm like, we are really, I mean, the bar is in hell at this point, but people are complaining because DEI execs, there's a gap between like the number of like Black DEI execs and like white DEI execs. So like I saw a stat that was saying that only like 3% of top ranking DEI officials are Black, whereas like 49% of them are white, and probably more than that, like 60 something were white, and maybe like 12 or 13% were Asian, and like 10 or 12% were Latino, whatever. And so people were saying like, oh, well, you know, now part of the reason that diversity isn't working because the people who are like at the top are not reflective of like the general population. And I'm like, well, they're never going to be reflective of the general population because the racial breakdown does, I mean, it's still also a class thing because to become CEO, top exec at, I don't know, insert whatever corporation, you still have to have a certain amount of credentials and a certain amount of education and so forth. And so, again, if you don't even deal with the political economic issue, if you care about the lack of corporate diversity, lack of diversity in the DEI space in corporate, then you should be caring about both of those things at once. So I think that's still going to be somewhat of a thing. I think that because there are enough Black people who, let's say, or enough people who know who have the frames to make grievance claims, I think it's never going to fall fully off the agenda. But I do think that you will see, I think you will see corporations ultimately still like pulling back from it. But in some ways, that is kind of so I did it. I don't know if you listened to the Dig or if you listened to the Dig podcast, but I did an interview pretty much talking about the paper that we were discussing earlier, where even if there's no like systemic change, like there's still going to be somebody or some people who can take those grievances to the bank. And so I think you'll still see some of that. Like the academy is weird because I think it depends where you are in the academy. Like most public institutions are really struggling right now. And so I don't think that people are as focused on that. I think at your Ivy pluses or even like prestigious state schools, I think it'll still be kind of the same thing. But I think one thing also we can't like neglect is how much even though obviously Hollywood has had its thing with the strikes and whatnot, that language is still so dominant in so much of the thing. Even like shows that I wouldn't expect to see like the diversity stuff creep up, it still does. And so I feel like that does a lot of work in keeping that discourse kind of percolating right beneath the surface, if it may not, be the top thing at the moment. And so that's something else that I think probably is going to be at play too. And even with like, I used to be a big like awards person, and then I like woke up one day and I was like, why do I care so much about the Oscars? Like this shit has no significance or anything whatsoever. But anytime there's like, all of the lead actors are white, that turns into like an Oscar so white thing. And then in sports, you see, it's just, I feel like there is enough among like the cultural apparatus to keep the DEI thing relevant. But I think the broader economy is going to kind of suppress the relevance, at least for right now. But I don't think it's going to be fully extinguished.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I want people to understand in some ways, I don't even think it's like regressive or anything. I just think it's kind of epiphenomenal. It's yes, it's probably good that there's more diversity on television. But does it change anything? I'm just gonna point to that Black poverty rate.
Well, that's the thing. Like I keep trying to, I can't discern whether or not people legitimately think that it does. Again, I'm like you. I'm like, obviously, like I don't want to turn on the TV and all I see is white people. Like I'm sure, like I'm glad that we are starting to in some ways reflect the way that the broader population looks. Yeah, I will applaud that until the cows come home. But I've talked to people, and like even when I'm giving an example, like when Angela Bassett didn't win the Oscar, although she had seemingly been the front runner for most of the award season, and I remember saying like, I already know I'm going to wake up to a flood of think pieces talking about how she losing this Oscar is, and lo and behold, like somebody tried to connect it to slavery, and I'm just like that. But I think people legitimately feel that way, and I think some people are like cynically exploiting this because it's a way for them to. So I try to be more optimistic and hope that people mean well and just don't know, as opposed to like cynically like using this for their own gain. But it's really hard for me to discern sometimes.
Cultural argumentum ad slaverium is going to replace argumentum ad hitrilium as one of the most annoying tendencies on the internet. Like,
Yeah,
it's like, that is literally Hitler. That is literally slavery.
right.
Yeah, I mean, I even kind of get annoyed when Marxists talk about wage slavery, to be honest. I wish kind of we'd like, yeah, I mean, I get our point there, but maybe let's not do that.
Yeah.
Like, um, so Angela Bassett. Okay. Um,
Hey.
I um yeah, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, um I liked Woman King too.
Yeah, but that was Viola Davis.
Viola Davis. Ah, fuck, now I sound totally racist. What was the Angela Bassett movie?
She was in Black Panther. Black Panther
Oh,
and Black Panther 2. Yeah.
yeah, I know she was in Black Panther too, but I was like, that was up for an Oscar?
Yeah, she got an Oscar nomination. She was like the first person from a Marvel movie to get nominated for an Oscar. And what I kept saying was the Academy is like notorious about how much they hate comic book movies. Like if Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight movies couldn't get an Oscar nomination, why did we think she was going to win an Oscar for Black Panther? But yeah, but when she
Yeah,
didn't,
I
she
just
didn't win
assumed
the
she
Oscar
was a.
for Black Panther, there was a direct through line between her not winning the Oscar, and then it was doubly problematic for some people because she lost to Jamie Lee Curtis and they're the exact same age. So of course I saw think pieces that said, "Oh, well, this is further evidence of like white privilege," because Jamie Lee Curtis, as like a white woman, has the privilege of winning an award that Angela Bassett should have won. But that just goes to show how, like, since slavery, like black women have always had things like taken from them. And I'm just like, this is a reach. This is a reach.
Oh wow. See, my assumption that the bias against comic book movies was so thorough that like I figured Angela Bassett had to be another character in Woman King, but I just didn't remember. Uh, it's,
Like
it's
the only reason Heath Ledger won the Oscar is because he died. Like had he not died, he would not have won that award.
absolutely. I mean, like, uh, oh man, that's funny.
Yeah, I think DEI is, let's say, on life support. Maybe not quite that bad. It's on the downturn, but not. It's not out yet. So I think it's going to still be lurking in the shadows.
Yeah, I think that's. It's going to be interesting to see what happens now that a lot of those COVID era subsidies that were supporting things like childcare go up for two reasons. One, I remember reading something, some liberal was bemoaning different identity here, but that like, why has the percentage of women not in the workforce like not continually raised? I wonder. And I'm like, well, I can answer this question for you in 35 seconds. Women often have children, and if you are a single mom or even a mom in a family of where you have a stay-at-home partner, uh, or excuse me, or a partner at all,
Right.
who's not a stay-at-home partner, you are probably looking to reduce your childcare costs because even when you had the subsidies from the federal government backdoor lowering the price a little bit, it was still like $1,000 a month in most markets per one child for childcare. I don't think 2 children and you're already out of the making anything profitable from working.
Right.
Might as well be a stay-at-home parent until your kids are old enough to go to public school, if they still exist by that time. Anyway, so I just remember that hitting me, and then I was like, and my next thought was like, I wonder how this is going to affect like Black and Latin community, because there are a whole lot of people employed in that sector. So I was just like, I wonder if this is about to be another. I mean, you know, I'm not sure it's going to lead to unemployment, because like, fuck, we don't have enough people to do anything now. But it does seem like it's going to create bigger gaps and increase costs, because it just seems like it might be a cost spiral, and that might over time be quite bad. I don't know. And so that's the kind of stuff I'm thinking about what's going to affect like a lot of people in the African American economy, is all these COVID era subsidies are over, and where's that money going to come from? And the other thing is tied into that, and tied into indebtedness. And I know this does play into some unfortunate stereotypes that we should push against, but it is still statistically true that there are working single mothers are a slightly larger percentage of the Black population than a lot of other populations. How is this going to affect them when there's so much more childcare cost? You know, and we don't seem to be going back to the latchkey kid era of my youth. So, I'm just, I don't know. I really don't know. I think the obvious thing that we can see is it's going to be kind of bad. But I don't know that we know what all the effects are. Thank you so much. I it's really nice to kind of tie these issues of, you know, race and class back together, so people can try to like do what intersectionality promised to do, but somehow never actually does, which is like weigh them together. I know there are people who do add class to their intersectional matrix, but they usually do so in like.
But they treat class as an identity, which is weird to me.
Yeah,
identity.
That's a whole different. The month that I'm releasing this is going to be the month of November, and that is the month that I am doing a bunch of stuff in memorial for the Vampire Castle piece, which I helped publish a decade ago, but also kind of for me to wrestle with the death of Mark Fisher. And I might piss some people off in it. By the time that this comes out, I'll know if I have. But one of the things that I struggle with Fisher is actually his response to the identity problem was also to posit class as an identity and not as something that you do. And for reasons that make sense, it has to do with like cultural habitus and the way that cultural habitus even affects like your relationship to depression. This is all of like Mark's whole project in a lot of ways, but in a way that like when we talk about this stuff in political economic terms, really kind of doesn't help. And I think there's a whole lot of like the response to identity politics that is rightly class driven that ends up, however, taking class and turning it into an identity and not a role of which you are inhabiting at a given time. And like I said, I don't want people to not think that, you know, we both know habitus does matter.
Oh, totally.
But like you and I aren't blue collar anymore if we ever were. Like,
right.
Like it's just true. Like, you know, just because I grew up the son of a mechanic and a waitress turned nurse does not mean that I am still a blue collar worker.
Yeah.
Like,
so I'll just add one thing. I know we're kind of going long, but there's a really good piece by he's a sociologist named Rogers Brubaker, and he has an article. Well, he has a broader book that's like a collection of articles called, I think it's called Ethnicity Without Groups. But he has one article in that book called Racist Cognition. And I think
Mm.
it could probably be applied to class too. And what he argues is that we need to stop thinking about race as an identity and rather think about it as a way that people cognitively understand like the spaces that they inhabit. And that can be done through other social networks that they're embedded in. But part of the reason we should do that as opposed to thinking about it as an identity is because that identity tends to run into the same problems of reification and all those other things. And so I find that a useful way to think about it, like racist cognition. And I think that can probably be applied to class too. It's a way of like orienting your mind to think about your own position as somebody who is a laborer. But that doesn't mean you have to me, like the whole identity framework tends to lead to partisanship, which once you get to partisanship, it's almost impossible to have any type of coherent set of like politics. And so I think that's the way we should be going versus the identity.
I'm going to not go into the long tirade I have as of the way that I think partisanship today is not about actual politics. It's about affinity groups, which itself is an extension of informal kinship relations at a nearly semi-conscious level. And like, uh, because that you want to get into like deep tier Varn stuff. That's the Varn stuff where I start talking about like stuff that Marx doesn't talk about, like why uh why how we address people, and how we think about that cognitively, both as a class solidarity, but like one of the reasons why I oppose like Robin DiAngelo stuff so incredibly much is not because I think we should be race blind, but there is a way in which I should not approach people of color as something that is inherently that I'm going to be inherently antagonistic around, because then I'm going to exclude them. And it's actually going to make it harder to get them into affinity groups where they, like in our current society as it's currently structured, could possibly benefit. And so to me, it actually has a perverse incentive to that, because it just doesn't admit how much these informal networks drive the way we move within a workplace, within the class.
Totally.
And we get advantages within the class, not between them. And like shutting people out of that racially is a disaster for bridging that, except through weird state interventions and top down stuff, which breeds resentment and furthers the cycle. And like and that's something that I think a lot about. And so thank you for bringing that up, because that's a good point to end on. Thank you so much for coming on. People, where can people find your stuff, Jared?
Yeah, so if you are still in the hellhole that is Twitter, you can find me there. But I'm currently working on my book project. It's not out yet. Fingers crossed it will be fairly. I don't know how soon is soon, but I have some articles. If you go on my website, it's just I think jaredkclemons.weebly.com. I have a link to the article that we talked about earlier, which is called "From Freedom Now to Black Lives Matter: Retrieving King and Randolph to Theorize White Anti-Racism." So obviously, I'm engaging a lot of MLK and A. Philip Randolph's understanding of anti-racism when they were thinking about it compared to now. So yeah, look out there. I published on different outlets, The Nation, and so you can just Google me, you'll find me.
All right, yeah. All right. Thank you very good. Thank you again. And those, I will link your page in the show notes, and we are out.